Now you can get Talk 1470 WNN on 95.3 FM too. Loud and clear. Health and Wealth Radio, WNN.
The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
It's Monday night at 9. Time for Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel, a certified sex therapist and sexuality educator. Dr. Siegel is here to answer all your questions about sex and sexuality that you might not have known who to ask. He'll also welcome special guests to talk about a wide variety of topics within the fascinating world of sexuality. So, welcome to Sex Talk.
Good evening, folks. Monday night at 9 o'clock, time again for Sex Talk. My name is Ricky Siegel, certified sex therapist, sexuality educator, and I'm really excited to be back again with my number one guest, my brother Larry Siegel,
Hello,
clinical
my Drew.
sexologist. How you doing? Good to come. I'm glad to have you back again to continue our conversation from last week.
Yes.
Just about finished our first month doing the show. Really excited to have this forum to be able to talk about our favorite subject, answer questions. I really want to encourage folks to start calling in. If you're listening on the radio, we are on 95.3 FM, 1470 AM, if you're in the Palm Beach and Broward area. Of course, the show is streaming live on Facebook, and you can call in. The number to call, you'll see on the screen shortly, is 888-565-1470. As the intro said, this is a place to ask your questions you might not have known where to ask before. So last week, we went right up the full half hour, just blew by talking about some of the things we like to get passionate about, some of the things that irk us about the sex-negative culture that we, it's great. We get the thrill, the honor to do this work. It really is amazing. And, but yet the milieu in which we have to do this work, like we've been talking about for the past few weeks, is a little crazy.
Yes, it really is.
But before we jump back into where we left off last week, we were talking about the sex-negative culture in which we have to do this work, and we were talking a bit about sex addiction, the sex addiction industry, and the problems inherent in it. But I didn't want to forget again that we had a question from the show the week before last from a dear old friend, another sex therapist in Boca Raton named Ellen Sherman. Ellen, if you're listening, big hugs to you.
Hi, it's been a very long time.
It has. We'll have to get you in here one of these days as our guest. That would be terrific. But Ellen had sent in a comment, a question, after the show we did with the lovely Stacy Friedman, the sex coach. And I think I need to have Stacy in again. I think I need a little bit more... not convincing is too strong a word, but she talked about what sex coaches are and what they do. And as Ellen pointed out, I think professionals tend to get it. I was delighted to hear Stacy talk about the PLICIT model, which is kind of a in the field acronym, permission giving, limited information, specific suggestions, and intensive therapy, which most sexologists understand as kind of a way of defining the scope of practice, defining which lane people stay in. Sexuality educators do the permission giving and the limited information, and medical, sexual medicine clinicians might do more of the specific suggestions. And of course, it's to the therapists, licensed clinicians, to do intensive therapy. And Stacy was very clear about that line and how sex coaches are trained, how far they can go and when to make referrals. But the real issue is, does the public get it?
I would think most professionals don't get it. So I think the public really doesn't get it either, because
it's a blurry line.
There is, and we've had conversations with people before as well, trying to explain the difference between a sex coach and a sex surrogate. Just like we often have to try to explain to people the difference between a sex therapist and a sex surrogate. And how many people would say, "Oh, you're a sex therapist? You have sex with your clients?"
right.
No, that's a surrogate.
Stacy did address that, and we talked a little bit about sex surrogates, but the whole field is a little it's vague, right? Again, for the person seeking a helping professional. And I've been, since that show, I've been looking at a lot of websites on the internet, and I think a lot of sex coaches, the field in general, the lines are, I don't know if it's intentional, but the lines are very blurry. I see a lot of sex coaches advertising services that sound an awful lot like sex therapy. Like, for example, for a coach to advertise that they treat erectile dysfunction, that's
a little shaky ground.
Yeah, that's rubbing the lines between those lanes a little bit.
And I think coaching kind of specifically tries to do that. A very, very dear friend of ours for a very long time, Patty Britton, who pretty much started sex coaching. She does most of the training.
Well, we could say she literally wrote the book on sex coaching, and we dedicated the show I did with Stacy to Robert Dunlap, our dear friend who sadly passed, Patty's partner.
Tough loss.
And they started the Sex Coach University. And again, we know the level that they strive, the professionalism, the academic rigor, the supervision, but anybody can call themselves a sex coach. And without any training at all. And how does the public know the difference? There have been cases where harm has been done.
Sure. And we know that a lot of people who call themselves sex coaches are getting into bed with them, are kind of acting more as surrogates, are acting as sexual partners. And I think, the biggest problem with sex coaching that I see, that I'm just going to focus on for right now, because I've got a lot of issues with coaching in general. But I think that one of the biggest problems that we have with sex coaching that makes it even more confusing for the general public is that there are no standards and there are no state laws and there is no set of guidelines that sort of regulate and oversee the practice. So you have people that get trained through wherever they're getting their training from, and they're practicing all over. So what are the state laws? Somebody who is a sex coach in Florida has got to be operating under very different guidelines than somebody who is a sex coach in California.
But if there are no guidelines, state to state, nationally, right? It's an unregulated field.
You're right. When I say guidelines, I'm talking about that, like for therapists. Right. For example, in Florida, we are not allowed to touch our clients in a sexual way. But a lot of sex coaches, they're doing a lot of very sexual touching.
Well, yeah, Stacey and I talked about that too. The idea, especially, it seems California is its own country in this field, right? The land of the sexological body worker, and the very blurry lines between types of practitioners, and how loosely we could use the term clinician. Right. I saw another one just today. I hadn't heard about this before. Someone advertising as a sober coach. Now, not a therapist, not a sponsor, not a companion. I don't know, right? There's etiquette coaches and there's life coaches.
And it's a hard one for me to swallow in some ways, because I originally was very critical of coaching, especially life coaching, when it first started, because I really saw it as nothing more than people who wanted to do the work but didn't want to be bothered getting a degree or getting a credential. Right? So it was sort of like an end around of professional standards. Again, knowing Patty and knowing what she's put together and how she approaches sex coaching and the integrity that we know that's there, I think there is, a better place, or maybe a clearer place in sex coaching than in something like life coaching. Because I think there's the line between counseling and coaching is much thinner there. And going back to your question about how does the public, the average person deal with that. I don't know, some people may not like me saying this, but I'm going to say that probably the first person somebody should talk to if they're thinking about that should be a sex therapist.
Sure.
Because I think it really should be on the therapist to see if this does not require the intensive therapy, then that may be something that a coach could deal with.
Right.
We know the psychoeducation stuff. We love that made-up word that we use in sexuality education. There's room for that too, but I see a place for sex coaching.
There are a number of licensed clinicians who include in their services coaching, and I get that, right? Not everybody comes to therapy with major mental illness, major depressive disorders, or there's that really tired, overused, lazy diagnosis, adjustment disorder.
Right.
That seems more often than not a way of getting paid from the insurance company, because really, what doesn't qualify as an adjustment disorder in life? But for some, maybe it's just personal. I feel more comfortable with someone who has the license and that regulatory watchdog to call themselves a coach and say, sometimes you don't need intensive therapy. I can help you through these life adjustments, etc. But the coaches now come up and say, we do this, but we don't go, we'll refer if you need that intensive therapy. But
yeah, but there's also a fine line for them letting go. But I think what you just said is very important, because it comes down to accountability.
yeah,
If they're a licensed practitioner that is doing this coaching as well, they have accountability.
exactly.
Somebody who just calls themselves a coach, they do something harmful or something happens to one of their clients, what's their recourse? Who do they go to?
Right. We've talked about this in the many years we spent training massage therapists in ethics and the kind of psychology of doing that work.
Right.
And again, what a license represents, kind of a three-way contract between the professional, the state, and most importantly, the public at large.
Right.
Right? So I can go on eBay and buy a used massage table and go down by the beach and set it up and take a woman's bikini top off and give her a massage. And, I might get arrested for lewd and lascivious, or she might get arrested, right? There might be some charges because that's inappropriate for a number of reasons.
Right.
But if I'm not a licensed massage therapist...
Exactly.
Right.
There's no
Now,
recourse.
if I'm a licensed massage therapist and I'm doing topless massages on the beach,
Right.
now I'm representing the profession. Now, not only could I get arrested, but I could lose my license. And the
Right.
field has the right to say, you're no longer representing us.
Right. And I think that's a perspective that most people don't understand and really don't ever get presented with. And I think a lot of professionals as well, that when you talk about professional boards, especially licensing boards, understand they don't regulate the profession. They regulate the professionals. So if somebody is licensed, then they have an accountability to the board. But if they're not licensed, they have no accountability.
Sure.
They may at most get a cease and desist order. But that's about it. So, professions regulate themselves, not their general field.
And the professional, right, yeah. And when it comes to sexuality, unfortunately, there's so many arenas. We've worked with pharmacy, for example, issues where a pharmacist, has some kind of religious prohibition against participating in a particular, they don't want to dispense birth control pills because...
Right, the ridiculous conscience clause.
Right. A nurse in a hospital who refuses to participate in a procedure because, it violates a particular religious...
Yeah.
Professionals need to understand that it's almost like like taking vows. If you're going to participate in a profession, the profession's ethics take a front seat to your own.
Absolutely.
Right. If you can't fill prescriptions because they cause that sort of lump in the throat hesitation, maybe research is more your arena.
Sure.
Right. If you're an emergency room technician and you refuse to, your faith doesn't allow, say, for example, blood transfusions. You're not allowed to deny a patient who's bleeding to death a blood transfusion because of your beliefs, right? So again, maybe that's not the profession for you. So back to our usual rant, the therapists that don't talk about sex, right? The plumbers that don't do toilets. Why this is a conflict for that professional choice.
And I can see, given that, how, sex coaching has kind of filled a little gap, where there may be between, sex ed, sex therapy, sex counseling, and it may not really fit in any of those particular places. So, there could be certainly a standalone place for it. But I think people have to just be very, very careful. There's no real or standardized credential. You want to look to see what kind of professional organizations people are a part of, before looking at a coach. What are their standards? What would happen if something went wrong? What would your recourse as a consumer actually be? Because we know it's there for pretty much all other facets of the profession, including, by the way, surrogates, who basically work through therapists. So, that's actually pretty tightly standardized. It's a relatively new area. I think people are still finding their way. It can certainly serve a purpose, but we have to make sure that I think it's done with integrity.
Yeah. And now that we're having this discussion, it's occurring to me that as sex phobic as the larger field is, we could probably use all the help we can get.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So if there are sex positive folks out there who want to help, who want to bring pleasure to couples, to help folks get past these obstacles, especially if they're working with therapists who are so avoidant, we need to welcome them to the team. We were trying to figure out what percentage of therapists have training in sexuality, even so much as an undergraduate sex ed course, right? Or how many identify as sex therapists. We've mentioned on the show before this national, now somewhat international organization, our professional home called ASECT, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. And at last count, I believe there's somewhere around 700 some odd certified sex therapists through ASECT. Again, not the only organization, but the largest.
Right.
And
well, the only certifying body.
Right, as a private member organization that certifies its members. So 750 certified sex therapists in the entire United States.
Right.
I'm sure there's 700 therapists between Boca, Delray, Fort Lauderdale, right? Why is this like a single percentage point? Why is it, we're getting back to that conversation, why is this such a bizarre specialty in a field that deals with relationships and families and sex?
Well, I think there's issues that are very similar to what we used to deal with when we were working more in the field of, let's say, adolescent sexual health. Sex and sexuality is really kind of the one area that we've seen, particularly among professionals, where people think their own experience is good enough. Right? Even with adolescents, we'd have adolescents that would, say things like, what are you going to tell me about it? I've had sex 12 times. I know all about it. Right?
Or I was an
adolescent. And again, we know, in that field, and we've said that before, that people really go into it because they care. They may have good intention, but they don't have the background, they don't have the understanding, they don't have the training. And sexuality is the only area, particularly in mental health, that I think people go into that with that attitude, that anybody can do it. So why don't people get certified? Why don't they get trained? Because they don't think they need to. Because they think they can just talk about sex as part of whatever they're doing and everything will be okay.
Well, I'm not denying that there are therapists that feel that way, but I would bet that there are far more who say, that's outside my wheelhouse. I don't have training in there, so I'm going to avoid the subject altogether.
Sure. Sure, but
Right.
I think it's larger. I think there's less avoidance than there is just assumption.
How many graduate psychology programs have even the basic kind of undergraduate sex ed course that we do at Palm Beach State College?
Yeah.
How many medical schools? How many?
Less than 1% of marriage and family therapy programs even offer a course on sexuality.
Right. And yeah, we've said that before.
Mm-hmm.
I confess a lie. I keep saying I don't like to bash. I'd like to bash.
Yeah.
Right? Again, we were
Bash
saying,
away, my brother.
We were saying last week, we understand that a movement, a revolution, a way of getting people to think of these issues as from a sexual health perspective is truly the key. But this pathologizing trend is so powerful, it's so dominating the discourse that it seems this whisper, this mousy little, can we please talk about sexual health?
Well, it sells.
Yeah,
Right? It sells. The sex negativity sells.
It does. The fear, the
Getting
disease.
people to feel badly about themselves sexually sells.
Yeah. So before we run out of time again, let's get back to picking up where we left off. Last week we were talking about sex addiction. Let me just do a halfway break again. If anybody's listening wants to call in with a question or a comment, you can call us at 888-565-1470 or use the little send an email feature on the Facebook page, Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. We were kind of complaining, doing a bit of bashing at the sex addiction industry. From our experience clinically, with yours in education and mine in my sex therapy practice, just to see couple after couple for whom not only does the quote sex addiction treatment not fix the identified problem, but does damage, sometimes permanent damage to the relationship.
Sure.
Right.
Sure. Especially when I think it's very commonly set up that there's usually the one identified person
Right.
who's the sex addict, or even worse now, watches porn.
Well, yeah. When's the diagnosis made? When someone's busted.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And that was really the whole beginning of this sex addiction thing, because it ended up being, hey, don't blame me. It's not my fault. I have a disease.
We talked about that last week when it was, the get out of jail free card for the person
Right.
who got caught cheating,
Right.
or the serial, philanderer or something like that. But now everybody's more obsessed, and we talked last week about politicians referring to porn as a public health crisis,
Right.
when the absurdity of it, getting back to that idea that we're still too childish and immature to talk about the real issue, which is masturbation, right? Porn is a tool, a fantasy generating thing that most people, individuals and couples often use to spark some arousal, or individuals as an aid for masturbation.
Right.
And that's until we can talk about that, right? It's way easier to just blame the porn. As if,
Well, it's also easier to blame porn than take responsibility for the relationship, especially for the partner who feels betrayed.
Right.
Why you're supposed to be attracted to me? Why are you watching this? This porn.
And I can't compete with these
Right.
images.
Right.
Right.
And it becomes this setup where if you had that one partner, usually a male, who is caught, and again, it's a busted thing, caught, and I just love the phrase, looking at porn.
Yeah.
Right?
That's as silly as sleeping
It
together,
really
isn't it?
It really is.
Both hands
but
on the keyboard,
But
just
then what
looking.
happens is it doesn't become, how do we deal with this? What is going on in this relationship that may have this person prefer solitary masturbation as opposed to an intimate connection with their partner? Instead of looking at maybe the big picture, see what's going on, it tends to be that common setup of, well, you're awful, you're terrible, I'm the victim, and you have to prove yourself to me if I can trust you.
Right.
And it becomes a doghouse kind of thing.
Exactly.
And I love how you have often kind of characterized this dynamic, especially when it in a heterosexual relationship, where it's usually the male is the perpetrator and the woman is the victim, and she basically becomes mommy at that point.
Right.
And how could there possibly be any coming back together? How can there be any erotic connection after that? Because like you often say, we are wired to not be turned on by mommy.
Yeah, this is one of the biggest issues that therapists, couples counselors, sex therapists see. Relationships, people forget their lovers. And when they get into that switch, if there's this angry, I will not allow porn in my house. Have you looked at porn today? That's not something a lover says. That's something an angry, judgy parent says.
Right, exactly. And, add to that the histrionics. And I'm using that term, histrionics. It's hyperbolic when you talk about these things that people are saying, like the danger of porn. People saying that porn is as deadly as crack. Right?
As addictive as heroin.
More addictive. Focus on Family likes to point out, as a lot of those people do, that porn is actually a harder addiction to break than heroin.
Yeah.
Now, again, we acknowledged last week, and we always acknowledge that there are people that do have problematic relationships with their porn use and with their solitary sexual behavior.
Again, we're running up against the clock, and I'm, it was juicy things right at a time when we have to wrap up. But just think about how much time people spend on the average time spent looking at porn compared to the average time spent watching television or on Facebook or checking cell phones and texting. We clearly are selective.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
And the porn, the amount of time with porn is really very, very low compared to all of those other things.
David Lay has research on this. And a wonderful book I want to plug called Ethical Porn for Dicks. If you're really, it's a good read if this is the slightest bit of an issue. He pointed out some of this data, 5 hours of television. And want to talk about impacting messages and what it does to the brain with today's constant onslaught. Anyway, it's that time again. I hope we'll just continue the conversation. Really want to encourage you, if you're watching on Facebook or listening on the radio, don't be shy. Call in, email some questions. And one more time, 888-565-1470. Write it down for next week. We'll be here Monday, 9 o'clock. And thanks for tuning in.
See you then.
You've been listening to Sex Talk with Dr. Richard Siegel. Join us every Monday night at 9 on WNN, 1470 AM and 95.3 FM. Or watch live streaming video at AMP2 TV Productions on Facebook, or look for the shows on YouTube. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next week.
The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.